Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sabrina Fung. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests, it is really my pleasure to be here this afternoon for today's AGI lecture and discussion led by Rana Mitter, who just landed Hong Kong from London this morning. So welcome, Rana. And I have to apologize on behalf of my father, Victor, who's chairman of the AGI Advisory Board. He sends his apologies because unfortunately he's got a really bad cold and didn't want to infect everybody. So apologies for that. Well, the Asia Global Institute is really an independent think tank within the auspices of HKU. It aims to lead discussion of major global issues from Asia's perspective. The program brings people and ideas together to promote collaboration, debate, and create new ways of looking at the matter. Harvard Kennedy School's mission is to improve public policy and leadership so people can live in societies that are safer, freer, and sustainably prosperous. AGI and the Kennedy School are longtime strategic partners, guided by our common interest in informing global policy. Last December, we walked away from a very successful panel discussion with the Kennedy School delegation, enlightened with better knowledge of the current state of US-China relations. We understood better their divergence and convergence, as well as the impact on international geopolitical climate. Today, in the series of joint events with the Kennedy School, Rana's discussion of the future of China will introduce another dimension to our understanding of China's relations with the West. Rana will examine some key ancient and historical events that shaped political thinking and policy making in China today. For as we all know, and as Winston Churchill wrote, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It is a special opportunity to have Rana with us today, and I urge you to listen, learn, and engage in what I'm sure will be an active discussion. Thank you very much.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hei Wai Tang, the director of the Asia Global Institute. I know you all come for Rana Mitter, so I'm just going to give a polite and short introduction about Rana. Rana Mitter is a ST Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has written a lot of books, including Forgotten Alley, China's World War II, which won the 2014 Duke of Westminster Medal for Military Literature and was named a Book of the Year in Financial Times and Economist. He has also written a lot of shorter articles in Foreign Affairs, Harvard Business Review, and The Guardian, among many others. He has commented regularly on China in media and in international well-known forums such as World Economic Forum at Davos. He won the 2020 Medicott Medal for Service to History, awarded by the UK Historical Association. He previously taught at Oxford University, and I guess many of you were Oxford affiliates or alumni. He just joined Harvard Kennedy School August 2023, and he's going to share with you, less than a year ago. So Dee was like, well, Rana must be there for many years. So he's going to share with you, his first 10 months in Cambridge, Massachusetts, rather than Cambridge, the UK. He is a fellow of the British Academy. In 2019, he was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, for services to education. So I did prepare something that is more substantial than just talking about his bio. At the Harvard Kennedy School, he has been teaching a course called China and the World, Challenges, Competition, and Cooperation. And I read the sort of description of the course. It said, how has China's rise changed the world of the 21st century? Important question. What are the forces and factors that shape its global behavior? Also a very important question. And most importantly, which is, I think, the key idea of today's talk, and I look very much forward to it, and that is how we should understand China's history and how it can explain important aspects of contemporary policy and decision-making. So today he's going to give a short presentation, about half an hour, with a title called Reading China's History, Reading China's Future by Reading the Past, How China-West Relations are being shaped today by historical thinking. So I'm not a historian, but I always think that having some deep understanding about China's history is going to help us to understand what's going on in China, between China and the West, and also geopolitics around the world. And we're going to have a panel discussion later, and I will introduce the panelists in half an hour. So Professor Mitter, your stage. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. I just want to check, can I be heard on the far side of the room there? Great. Fantastic. Do sort of yell or let me know if I'm not audible at any point. It's a huge pleasure to be back in Hong Kong. I have not been here since the pandemic, and I know that that was a very difficult time here as it was in much of the world. So it's a double pleasure to be back and to also see people able to move around freely again after what was, I know, a very, very difficult time. A reminder that we can sometimes live through historical events, but they're not always entirely pleasant to live through. Much more pleasant is the task that I have, just briefly, if I may, to thank Sabrina and also Victor, who I know couldn't be here tonight, but was very instrumental in getting the event here together. On behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School, we're very, very grateful to you and also to Heiwei and everyone from AGI for providing the framework for today's event. And I hope very much it is going to be an event which has some sort of collective rather than simply individual value. I'm honoured to be here to start off the discussion. I promise not to speak for more than 3.5 hours, no, about 30 minutes today. But I know that with our panelists today, we have expertise in economics, in environment and in philosophy, amongst other matters. And I'm looking forward to learning a great deal from my fellow panelists and also from you, the audience. The reason I put it that way is that I was reminded last week in an encounter I have how cautious those of us who work in the West have to be about interpreting the modern state of China and the wider world, and how far we seek to find data and information and knowledge that helps us to do that in comparison with the other side. So the reason that I make that comment is that I was at a well-known think tank in Beijing. I was just in Beijing last week, and one of the scholars there, who very much grounded inside the Chinese system, asked me, as someone who now lives in the United States, who I thought might win the presidential election that's coming up in just a few months. And I gave what I think is the most honest answer, which is that it's very close and nobody really knows between President Biden, President Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And he looked very impatient and he kind of stopped. And I said, no, he said, no, I don't mean that. He said, for instance, when I look at the data behind what's happening in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, I see that you can see that there are these clumps of Democrats who are sitting right outside the main part of the city. But then you also see these large Republican areas that are in the western and the northeastern part of the state. And he went through this very, very detailed account of the voter habits of people in Pennsylvania, which presumably he'd gathered from many, many years of America watching, despite having spent his life in a Chinese think tank. I said to him afterwards, on the level of detail that he was able to show on American politics, that if he ever left his job with the CPC, he could certainly get a job with CNN. And he certainly seemed to be considering the option at least. That's by way of reminding us that in China at the moment, there is a tremendous amount of very detailed knowledge on many aspects of politics and society in the West. But in the West, I think we should still be humbled, in the United States, in the UK, in Europe and elsewhere, by the realization that learning about frameworks and ideas that help us to interpret what is happening just north of here is still a work very much in progress. Those of us who've been doing this at the Kennedy School, at Harvard more broadly, and in many Western institutions, hope that the task that lies before us is one that has some effect in terms of bringing about a greater understanding between the two sides, but also very aware that we have a long way to go before I can match that CNN-like analyst that I met in Beijing last week. What I want to do today, rather than trying to mention very specific events or trends that are happening, as it seems to me, in the relationship between China and the West, and we can, of course, talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like to do that. There's plenty going on and plenty to discuss. But instead, I wanted to put forward a framework of understanding, which I think adds a level of broader understanding to contemporary events that isn't often appreciated enough in the wider world outside China. And in doing that, I'm hoping that the technology will work with me. Do we have the PowerPoint? Yes, there we go. And I'm going to cover essentially the main points that I put up here, which are what I call sources of influence on the way in which China's social thought, in other words, thinking about society at home, and international thought, in other words, thinking about China's place in the world, seem to be emerging in the present day. And I want to say something, just a few minutes worth, on each of the four topics that you see there. Something about economic legitimacy and the way in which I think it is sometimes brought into a historical framework. The second issue is modern history itself, the long period, let us say, from the mid-19th century up to the mid-20th, which I think still contains a whole variety of events, many of them traumatic, revolutions, wars, and others, which continue to have a very powerful shaping effect on contemporary China. The third being what I'm broadly calling traditional thought. In other words, to me, fascinating return to an interest in ideas that come from China's pre-modern past, and in particular, the world of philosophy. And I know that we have a doctorate in philosophy on our panel. It is, of course, from Oxford, but nonetheless, we will forgive that on this occasion and allow to be part of the conversation. You see how quickly I turn when they pay me. But and sticking, in a sense, with the broad idea of philosophy, I also want to talk, as you'll see in the fourth point there, about Marxism-Leninism. And I'll lay my cards on the table. There's been a bit of a trend in recent years, particularly amongst some analysts of China's economy and politics, to argue that it may have a communist government in name, but the ideas that underpin communism, Marxism, Leninism, don't really matter. We're in a post-ideological age. It's all about realism and pragmatism. I think that's wrong. I think actually there are all sorts of areas in which understanding the philosophical basis that has shaped Chinese politics in its dominant form for many decades now still has value. And I'll go on to explain why I think that's the case. So with those four areas, let me turn to each one for a few minutes. And economics, a subject I think of great interest to many people in this room, whether as scholars or in many cases as practitioners of economic growth, development, finance, and so forth, might in many ways seem to be one of the areas that seems to be, in a sense, beyond the idea of being culturally shaped by historical precedent. And yet I think in some ways you can see a great deal of the forces which have gone on to shape contemporary China's understanding of economics in a very strongly historical sense. Take the term 共同富裕, common prosperity, not heard so much perhaps in this last year or two, but certainly 3 or 4 years ago, very much put into public play as an explanation of the overall project, the overall idea of what economic change in China was supposed to do, and pushed very hard by the leadership of China during that time. Prior to that, and still very much with us, is the idea of the aspiration of China to become a Xiaokang, or moderately prosperous society. All of these terms, of course, have a longer historical background, which goes well back into the imperial period. And it's certainly notable that in ideas of social welfare, in terms of common prosperity and the common good, that the Ming and Qing emperors also found themselves very much drawing on that vocabulary in a way that certainly has cultural resonances in the present day. But one of the purposes, I think, also of drawing on that kind of historical linguistic repertoire in shaping contemporary economic models and ideas is that in some ways it provides a contrast with one of the other powerful languages or discourses on the economic future of China, which is the dependence on science and technology. This, of course, as you know, also has a very strong connection from the late Qing dynasty through the Republican period into the present day. Famously, along with the cry for Mr. Democracy, the May 4th protesters of 1919 talked about Mr. Science, Cai Xiansheng, as being a very important part of the repertoire of politics which they thought would shape China into the modern era. And that idea of science and technology being linked in terms of their overall economic benefit, as I say, was very, very central all the way from the Qing dynasty onwards. If we think of the idea of Fu Guo Qiangbing, the strong country and the rich country and strong army, which moved figures such as Yan Fu and others in the late Qing period, many of those ideas and senses of how a state should be set up have continued all the way through the early 20th century and into the present day of the People's Republic. So the shaping and the frameworks of those ideas that draw on a much longer imperial past, I think, are there even in areas such as economics, which are obviously central to the discourse of contemporary China and the social contract, but are not always associated with that historical past. I wanted to say that briefly, though, because the other three areas that I want to say something about are more explicitly historical, and I wanted to make the economic point by way of an introduction to make it clear that the historical elements I'm talking about are not the only things, clearly, that matter in terms of constructing an idea of modern China, but they do sit as a very important set of ideas. So let me turn to modern history as a whole. And I would say that overall, China, perhaps more than any other major society in the world today, draws on its own experience of modern history, particularly the century or so between the mid-19th and mid-20th century, as a very important framing for the way in which it thinks about international relations in the present day in particular. Being here in Hong Kong, obviously we are very aware of the First Anglo-Chinese War, 1839 to 1842, often colloquially known as the First Opium War, and a set of events which led to the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, which led to the cession of Hong Kong Island and a variety of other concessions to Britain and then later other European empires as well as the Japanese, leading to a longer history, which of course ultimately led to the return of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty back in 1997. And even today, the use of the idea of not just the Anglo-Chinese Opium Wars, but also, of course, the confrontations with other powers such as Russia and Japan, leading to, of course, the occupation of parts of Dongbei, Manchuria, the northeastern part of China, starting in 1904 to 5, and then growing further in expansion in the early 1930s, continues to be a very important part of the wider shaping of Chinese ideas about the outside world, in particular as a place which has not always treated China particularly well in the early 20th century at a time when the state was weak, leading to systems of thought that today often make China quite suspicious about the intentions of the international community, even at a time when China today is immeasurably strong in a way that was not the case 100 years or so ago. And for me, one of the transformative events in that particular set of changes are the events of the Second World War. Some of you who've been to my talks before will know that I've spent quite a lot of time looking at the history of World War II in China, an extraordinary titanic set of events, events that over the course of 8 years of warfare from 1937 to 45, in fact, official Chinese narratives date the beginning of World War II now to 1931 and the Japanese invasion of the northeast at that point of Manchuria. Most historians would still stick to 1937 as the outbreak of full-scale warfare. But those 8 years contain within them, as far as we can tell from partial statistics, 8, 10 or more million deaths in China during that period, including as well as the 2 or 3 million combat deaths, the starving to death of some 4 million people in Henan province in a terrible famine during that period, and many deaths in a variety of other events, either ecological disasters caused by war or direct consequences of combat and attacks on civilians themselves. But the war itself, as well as causing many deaths, a refugee crisis which led to some 80 to 100 million Chinese becoming refugees within the country, and also the destruction of large parts of the infrastructure of China, the roads, the railways and so forth, also proved a transformative moment. And I'll give an example of how I think that history is being used in the present day to try and put forward a different narrative about China's international position. But I might grab a glass of water. In particular, one of the elements that is most notable about China's international position today is its growing interest in creating a firm position within the United Nations organization. The head of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, is a Chinese nominee. There are, of course, many other Chinese operating in many other parts of the UN. China also is now, by many counts, the second biggest payer of dues, of fees, into the UN. And all in all, there's no doubt that today China sees itself as a central part of the organization. It's also worth noting that senior Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, and others, have taken the effort in various international forums, such as the Munich Security Conference, to point out that China was not just a signatory to the United Nations Declaration in 1945, when it was signed at San Francisco, but in fact was the first one to sign a concession, or not a concession, but an offer that was given to the Chinese government at the time in mark of respect for China's long 8 years of fighting during the Second World War. But of course, we are also aware as historians that the establishment of China in the UN and its placement, as it has, of course, a place today in the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, was actually also a product of the previous ruling Chinese regime, the Kuomintang nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. And the way in which that earlier period of history, which dates before the 1949 establishment of the People's Republic of China, is a sign of the way in which modern history can be adapted. As everyone in this room knows extremely well, I am sure, there was a long period from the 1940s through to the 1970s when any mention of actions that had taken place under that previous Kuomintang government was simply politically unacceptable in China because, of course, the Kuomintang had been defeated by the CCP in the Civil War of 1946 to 49. But in later years, the reappropriation, the embrace, you might say, of some of the aspects of that earlier regime as it related to China's international position could be brought out of the historical store cupboard and once again used to make a point in the present day. In other words, today's Chinese position of great authority and prestige at the United Nations is, of course, a mark of contemporary China's standing in the world as the world's second biggest economy and a major actor in the UN. It is also, of course, a product of that previous regime and its war against the Japanese and its victory in 1945, in which, of course, both the Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists were fighting in a united front against the invasion. So modern history continues to have a shaping effect in terms of the way in which today's engagement with international society operates. In the same sort of way, the Cold War experience is something that actually is also part of the historical shaping and reshaping of China's presence in the world. Anyone who has listened to the speeches of contemporary Chinese top leaders will know that the United States in particular is often criticized for having a Cold War mentality. But in fact, this phrase, Cold War mentality, in some ways makes too simple a rather more complicated story. Because, of course, historians again remember that the Cold War era was one in which China's status in relation to the other major powers in the world kept changing. China emerged into the beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s and 50s as an ally of the Soviet Union. In the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, it was essentially isolated from other parts of the world. And of course, by the 1970s and 80s, during an era of warming of relations between Deng Xiaoping's China and the United States, there was actually a great deal of cooperation between the two sides, while the Soviet Union essentially remained alienated from both. You might remember, those who have the right historical memory, that Deng Xiaoping famously visited the United States in 1979 and attended a rodeo in Texas, at which he wore a rather large Stetson hat as a symbol of a rather new sort of Cold War mentality in which the United States and China would come together. Now, nobody would argue, I think, realistically, that the warmth that Deng's China and the China of the US of the late 70s, early 80s under Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan is being reproduced today. The relationship between the two sides is difficult, and everyone, I think, acknowledges and understands that. But the actual history of the Cold War, with its complexities, as opposed to a sort of constructed idea, is important to re-examine to remind us that things change, and they change not by just some natural phenomenon, but because politicians and also business people, students, media people, people on the ground engage and interact with each other to make things change. In other words, there's nothing natural about a Cold War mentality any more than there is any other aspect of historical experience. The final element I want to bring in that I think has an important historical element is something else that is central to China's self-presentation today, and that's the idea of China as a global South actor, what used to be known 40 or 50 years ago as the Third World. And famously, again, you may remember that Deng Xiaoping was actually sent by Mao Zedong to the United Nations in 1974 to read out his speech on Mao's theory of the three worlds. The term Third World isn't used so much today for various reasons, but Global South is something that is heard. In fact, China itself has stated, not least after the recent G77 summit in Havana, Cuba, that China itself has always been a global South power. But what's often forgotten is that actually the origins of that particular type of engagement with the post-colonial world, with other countries that were emerging from the shadow of European and Japanese imperialism, again has a much longer history. Before the Belt and Road Initiative of today, there were efforts such as, of course, the Mao-era China's building or construction and financing of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway in East Africa during the 1970s. More broadly speaking, the Bandung Conference of 1955, where figures like Zhou Enlai essentially battled for leadership of that emergent post-colonial world with India, have echoes of the present day, where India and China both have some claim to a leadership role in contemporary Asia. And broadly speaking, those historical frameworks are useful in terms of reminding us that, again, many of the arguments today about how leadership is to be found in Asia have historical precedents as well. Let me turn a little bit now to another element that comes from China's past, but rather further back, that I think is making an intriguing series of returns to the public sphere. And again, to explain this in one sense may seem both obvious, but also important in terms of how things have changed historically. Let me explain what I mean. Today, we see that in many cases, language that would seem very familiar to those from the pre-20th century period who looked at the Confucianism and traditional thinking of the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Qing and beyond, seems to once again have a certain amount of power. And in some ways, this might seem natural on the grounds that the traditional thinking of figures such as Confucius, Lao Tzu, and others are a long-standing part of the Chinese cultural tradition. Today's ruling party refers to it often to the outside world as Chinese wisdom. It's a term that often gets used. But it's worth remembering that this is something relatively new, because if you were to make perhaps the strongest contrast between the era of Mao Zedong as the founder of modern Chinese communism and today's leadership, it is their attitude towards a traditional past that stands in the greatest contrast. For Mao and all of the most radical figures who took part in the May 4th movement of the early 20th century on and around 1919, in other words, during the 1910s and 20s, the rejection of Chinese tradition, the argument, in the words of the great Chinese fiction writer Liu Xun, that Confucianism, traditional thinking about Chinese philosophy, was a backward feudal enterprise that was no better than 吃人, cannibalism, eating people. This was a very, very savagely phrased rejection of almost everything in the Chinese past, which Mao and fellow radicals, not just communists, but others too, felt was bringing Chinese society down. And perhaps the lowest moment for Confucius and his legacy in 20th century China was during the Cultural Revolution, when famously the tomb of Confucius in Qufu was violated by Red Guards who wanted to make their protest against the philosopher clear. And it wasn't really until the 1980s that you start to see the revival and revision of Confucius actually as a figure from whom a kind of cultural and indigenously sourced philosophical tradition could be welded onto the thinking of the present day. This was something that actually even various figures who you might think of as die-hard members of the communist establishment put forward. To me, one of the most surprising efforts in this regard was an essay published in Renmin Zhibao, the People's Daily, in I think 1985 by Hu Qiaomu. Many of you will know he was the personal political secretary to Mao Zedong. He was in Yan'an. He was probably one of the most hardline figures in terms of the construction of contemporary Chinese communist thinking. And yet he actually wrote quite a significant editorial piece in the People's Daily, arguing that a brilliant figure like Confucius should be brought back in terms of the repertoire of political thinking that China should engage with. I might share a moment here. Actually, a few years ago at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, I was shown the personal library of Hu Qiaomu, this very kind of austere Chinese thinker on history and Marxism. Every single one of the books in the library was a book on Marxism-Leninism or philosophy or other quite hardcore matters. And I finally said to the person taking me around the academy, 没有小说嘛? Didn't he have any novels? To which the guy looked at me as if I was making a ridiculous remark and said, 不是，他是一个很认真的人物. No, he was a very conscientious personality. So clearly wasting time with frivolities like fiction is not the sort of thing that Mao's personal secretary should seek to do. But he did form part of the movement that brought the idea of traditional thinking of Confucius and other figures that drew on the Chinese traditional forms of philosophical thinking back into the public sphere. And today we see that those are much more widespread in terms of the debates that are going on in journals, in think tanks, and within China itself about how to draw on that wider tradition to understand the world of today. The concept of Tianxia, kind of all of the empire, sort of broad sense of the world, is one that figures like Zhao Tingyang and others in the Beijing philosophy and politics sphere have been writing about for some time. And certainly I can say that one of the think tank workshops that I attended last week in Beijing ended up with a very heated, or friendly, but heated 15, 20-minute debate between people there about which aspects of traditional thinking should be used to interpret the US-China relationship and the wider international society today. Bearing in mind again that just 60, 70 years ago, during the height of Maoism, such a discussion would have been, in most circumstances, almost impossible. It's a reminder of why it's significant to understand that these aspects of China's philosophical past are being brought back into discussion today, particularly since they tend to be the aspects that are least well analyzed by interpreters of China's international relations beyond China itself. It's much easier sitting in London or in Washington or even in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to look at what you might call the realist aspects of international relations, the way in which power, economic might, even soft power can be calculated against each other, understanding what is often a quite complex system of world views is, I think, less examined, but in some ways equally, if not more, important. And certainly it underpins many of the phrasings, which frankly in English translation often sound quite clunky, like, you know, communities of common destiny or harmonious societies, these sorts of terms. But to understand them as they come from a system of thinking which has origins in the Chinese tradition is an important first point. The second point to make is, of course, that China's politicians, like politicians anywhere else, are quite keen to take hold of often grand-sounding terms. There may be less there than the sum of the parts, but understanding how to analyze that is an important part of the mixture. And that return of traditional thought takes me in some senses to my last, but I think in some ways also crucial element in terms of understanding how historical frameworks shape a lot of political thinking in China today. And that is, I think, the continuing importance of Marxism-Leninism. In some ways, I would say that this is something that seems to be contradictory. Sometimes you get questions asked along the lines of, so, you know, today we know that traditional culture is coming back in China, but it calls itself the China, you know, it calls itself a communist state under a communist party. So is China a Marxist society or a philosophically traditional society? And I think one of the things that's most notable is that, in fact, it is a combination of both in a rather uneasy mix. Those of you who have made your way through the Party Resolution on History, which was published in November 2021, it's rather a long document. Not all of it is thrilling, but large parts of it are genuinely quite interesting in all sorts of ways. It's a statement by the people who sit and think about these things in the Dangxiao, in the party school in Beijing, about what they actually think the philosophical and political basis of the current Chinese project is. And to me, one of the things that's most interesting about that document is that it's defined in large parts as negative. So a large part of it says, we are not simple Marxists. We are not simple followers of a traditional path of thinking. We are not this, we are not that. So you keep reading through it and wondering, well, say, well, what are you in that case? But I think that might be waiting to the next resolution, which will be coming along perhaps in another 20 years from now. Until that point, it's worth noting quite what it is in terms of Marxist thinking that seems to be important. And I would say it's probably one term which actually, in some senses, is relevant because it contains within it an idea that actually comes from a much longer Chinese tradition rather than a Marxist one. So many of you who I'm sure spend long evenings reading books of Marxist theories, because that's what there is for fun to do in Hong Kong, when you're not out at dim sum, is to take the term contradiction, which is something that Marx took from the German philosopher Hegel and essentially used as a way of trying to understand how class struggle might operate in the 19th century. It was taken on board in the 20th. And the standard Chinese translation for this term is Maodun. That's the term that's normally used for a Marxist contradiction. But many of you will know that, of course, Maodun is a term which itself comes from a Chinese legend from ancient times, the idea of a Mao and a Dun, a sword and a shield. The sword being a sword that is so sharp that it can penetrate anything that it touches, and the shield being a shield that's so strong that it will resist anything that is poked at it. A little bit like the piece of Bai Tsai that I had on Cathay Pacific last night. But that was very nice, honest, he says. In other words, the contradiction of having a super sharp sword and an impenetrable shield. But the point is that to translate the term, again, drawing on that pre-modern tradition to express a particular sort of Marxist idea. Marxism, I think, still has a tremendously important shaping value for a lot of Chinese political thinkers, because it seems, for good or ill, to explain a great deal about the world today. not in terms so much perhaps of class struggle, although many think that that is perhaps coming back in all sorts of parts of the world after seeming to have disappeared in the neoliberal 1990s and 2000s. But in terms of, for instance, the struggle between the desire for fast economic growth and net zero, or green growth, or ecological civilization, if you use the term which is being put forward quite a bit in the mainland, or the struggle that is going on between the desire to create a richer society and a more equal one. And this could again operate not just in the context of China, but a whole variety of places, particularly in the global south. In other words, even if class struggle in the classic sense has been somewhat downgraded from the Marxist-Leninist repertoire, the idea of continued struggle and the pushing together of what in Marxist terms is called the thesis and the antithesis to create a synthesis still seems to have an explanatory power at a moment of turbulent global politics, which frankly most other theories don't yet necessarily seem to have a very clear way of explaining either. But they also sit in terms of being complementary rather than in contrast with the ideas that are allegedly coming from Confucius. Because if Marxist ideas are about struggle, are about radical teleology, trying to move society forward through a series of often very wrenching social changes, Confucian thinking is very much more about hierarchy. It's about trying to create a settled order, that people should undertake li, rituals or rites that essentially are the correct way of doing things. And in these two very contradictory ideas, a Maldun right there, the struggle between two different ideas, the idea of progress and the idea of order, I think sit very much behind a Chinese political project, which is seeking not only to stabilize itself at home, but also create a new presence for China in the wider world. Some of you will know that Hunan TV recently put out a 5-part TV show in which it attempted to reconcile these two different philosophical views of the world. The show "当孔子遇见马克思," which is actually based on an original short story by the great Chinese romantic writer Guo Moruo back in 1925. So a century later, Hunan TV is doing their own version. As you can see, the whole thing was done on an excellent budget with beards and everything provided there as well. But part of the message that's put forward in this television program is that, in fact, in some ways, the ideas of Confucius and Marx are perfectly compatible with each other. It has to be said that the reaction of Chinese social media, at least as I saw it, was pretty scathing. They thought that everything from the scripts to the production values to the fake beards to the overall idea behind the show was not entirely convincing. But the overall idea that actually there are ideas about a worldview that draws from China's very, very real and obviously intense engagement with Marxist-Leninist thinking, which is a large part of the story of the 20th century, and China's much longer engagement with its own indigenous repertoires of thought, which have in some ways been at the heart of not just Chinese, but also Korean, Japanese, and East Asian statecraft for millennia, is still the source of real and valid debate in the course of the 20th century, the course of the 21st century. And I conclude that thought by saying it is not that these are the only things that are important to understand, along with China's own painful modern history and how that relates to its position in the world, but without understanding those things, are often highly economically driven or geopolitically realist-driven understanding of the relationship between China, the US, the European Union, and other major, and indeed minor powers in the world is going to be impoverished. Because without that wider three-dimensional understanding, I think we fail to understand some very important things about how, for all of us, not just China, our pasts and the way that we understand those pasts shape our present and very much stand to shape our future. So I will leave those thoughts there so we can turn to a panel discussion and invite everyone to sit down.
fascinating, very polished, 30-minute talk covering both the long history and the modern history of China. I have to admit that my understanding of Chinese history is only up to grade 9 or Form 3 in Hong Kong. I did take a public exam in Western history, which only covered a tiny part of the Chinese history, and I grew up in a British colonial Hong Kong. So this is like a relearning opportunity for me. Rana, thank you so much. So we have a great panel here, two young new faces. And the whole point of having this panel is to make sure that we are not being dragged down to 3,000 years of history. And we want to bring everyone back to today's world, both in terms of what's going on in the global economy and obviously geopolitics that everyone is excited about. So first of all, we have Dee Poon, who is, I don't know how to describe you. So you are an art, cultural, multi-dimensional, talented person in town, a business leader, but she does have some official titles. But I think those official titles are not, the one that you should be known for. She is the president of brands and retailing for Tessellation Group, and she's also a board member of West Kowloon Cultural District Authority and M+ Museum. And Rana, if you haven't got a chance to visit the M+ Museum, Dee will ensure that you spend some great time over there. The proudest new introduction of Hong Kong about art and culture, obviously. Dee is also on the board of trustees for the SQYL Yang Education Foundation and Asia House, as well as the a board member of the Board of Mind in Hong Kong, tackling mental illness in Hong Kong. As we all know, many people suffer mental illness after many years of COVID. She's on the International Advisory Committee of Harvard University's Asia Center, Family Advisory Council of the Ownership Project at Oxford Said Business School, and also Global Steering Committee of Social Entrepreneurs to Spur Health. So I can go on to read the long bio of Dee, but she already said this is humiliating because I didn't really get to the core to describe her true passion and talent. But let me turn to Brian Wong. The short title is Assistant Professor in Philosophy at Hong Kong University. And last time I got it wrong that he took 3 years to finish his PhD from Oxford, and then he corrected me only 2.5 years. True talent, not only as a political philosopher, but a frequent commentator, author of many articles, and made a lot of comments about almost everything about the world, ranging from China to Kazakhstan to any corner in the world. I mean, I'm truly impressed.
TV show called When Confucius Met Brian.
Yes, that should be the one. But he's going to talk about geopolitics. He's also a Rhodes Scholar, like Bill Clinton, and many other famous people, getting the full scholarship to study at Oxford just 6 years ago. All right, so Rana, let me start by asking you two questions. I'm an economist. I have to talk about the global economy, and that's the only thing that I know to talk about. There are lots of points that I couldn't capture, but there are a few points that hit me very hard. First is about Mao's vision about the global South, going back all the way to the 50s and 60s when China was a very poor country. And now, obviously, the Chinese government is talking about the Belt and Road initiatives, new collaboration with countries in the Middle East, in Africa, and all the countries, in the BRICS Plus group. So help us to understand why, back in the days when China was so poor, where did they get the resources and the human capital and anything to help the poor countries? And why would that understanding about the long history of China's always trying to collaborate with the global South will help us to understand the new initiative? And I guess the Americans or some people in Europe always got it wrong that in order to deal with the geopolitics and the sanctions coming from the West, China was building friends, connections, and allies in the part of the world that is not necessarily so friendly to the US. So help us to understand, this particular question.
Thanks very much, Hei-Wei. So I would say that from a historian's point of view, the kind of quick and perhaps overly simple answer to your question. Sorry.
Just fine.
Oh. Is it on? That okay? Yes, that sounds audible. Hei-Wei, thank you for that. I would say that probably from a historian's point of view, or at least this historian's point of view, one of the simplest ways to get to the heart of your very good question is to say that in some ways, certainly for much of the 20th century, China's aspirations with regard to the wider world, particularly the non-European world, have always been exactly the same. The difference between then, 100 years ago, and now is then China didn't have any money, and today it has lots. And essentially it's able to put into action ideas which have been there for a long time. So very briefly, let me recap or say a couple of examples of what I mean by that. If you go to the 1930s, one of the most desperate times in terms of China's own history, invasion by Japanese and Manchuria, and a very weak polity under the Republic, which was essentially China was split from within. Nonetheless, think about figures like Gu Weijun, Wellington Koo, one of China's best-known diplomats of that era, who used China's actually very weak position at the League of Nations to make a really important case for China as a sort of exemplar, as a role model, at a time when almost all the other Asian states, except for Japan and Thailand, were actually colonies themselves. China was weak, but it was not fully colonized, and therefore was able to have a voice saying there should be something new. Then if you fast forward to the era of Mao, of course, by that time, the People's Republic is an independent state, and it didn't have huge amounts of resources, but many of the ways in which it tried to gain them were with the aim of creating a new Asian role for themselves in the region. In fact, they weren't even the first to do that. Kuomintang, in those few years from 1945 to 49, before they fled to Taiwan, actually were making a lot of outreach to other newly emergent independent Asian states as well. So in fact, there was a bit of competition between the two regimes on that. Some of the resources that China had came, frankly, from tragic means. One of the reasons you might remember for the Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1962, which created a horrific famine that killed millions, was the desire to try and essentially increase foreign sales of grain and other products and accumulate capital. That turned out to be a disaster and a tragedy, but the idea, in a very, very different form, emerges much, much later into the present era, when China, through being a much more active and positive member of the international economic community, which you, of course, know all about, has accumulated huge numbers of foreign exchange reserves, has accumulated huge amounts of capital that enables it to essentially send FDI to many places in the world. But you can make, I think, a very strong argument that this is a new version of a much longer standing idea that one way or another China should be a powerful regional actor in Asia with a mentor role, and beyond that, a power with global influence where it can manage to find it.
So, let me ask a follow-up question related to this, and that is, during Mao's era, do you think the Chinese government already foresaw what is going to arise in modern days? In other words, right, why would they want to work with poor countries when they had the opportunities to work with the US, with other rich Asian economies, or with Europe?
So that's again where I think actually history is important in telling us what's different and what's the same. So one element that, the answer I just gave you, I did mention in the talk, but I'll say it again, is this. Mao was going around the third world, the global south, as we'd now say, with a specifically revolutionary proposition. In other words, he didn't just want to basically improve infrastructure and make people a bit richer in a kind of capitalist sense. In fact, he reacted very strongly against what in the West became known as modernization theory. In other words, the idea that you use capital to create those sorts of capitalist societies. Instead, he wanted a complete overthrow, particularly after Mao broke with the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. He wanted to show in his eyes that the Soviets were nothing more than capitalists by another name, and that China had the answer in terms of overthrowing that kind of thinking of conventional economics. The problem being that in most of the cases where China had influence, the economic model that emerged wasn't very successful in the end. And countries like Tanzania, Zambia, and of course the Rhodesian liberation struggle against white rule there was also something where China had involvement in that sense. In the present day, it's clear, in fact, it's very explicitly said that China is not seeking to export revolution, certainly not in the kind of classic sense that it would have done in the 60s and 70s. But I think it is the case, and again, we could have further discussion, I think, amongst us, and as an economist, Hei-Wei, I'd love to hear your view. There is a sense in which the economic model that China is promoting today does have norms that are different from those that the Western dominant model has put forward in the last few years. For instance, it's very state-driven. In other words, the idea of sort of empowering civil society as part of a kind of wider economic unleashing, that's not really a central part of the Chinese proposition. It's very much about government working with government. There's also a strong sense of course, if you think of that term, common prosperity, the idea of reducing inequality, but it's also one that is very much based on the idea that collective values should have a certain amount of power. We, I think, heard various Chinese figures at the UN talk about the right to eat being the first human right. This is something, obviously, that's the subject of wide and often quite fierce debate. But those ideas are in themselves, I think, an attempt to push back against language and discourse which China today doesn't feel comfortable with and feels that its powerful position at the UN and elsewhere enables it to push back against.
So let me ask a follow-up question again about the economy, because I'm going to turn to Brian to ask questions about the philosophy of things. So your first slide talked about sort of the economic legitimacy of not just political governance, but science and technology. And I agree with you 100% that, if you go to China, you see all this new innovation, and most of them are really for tackling social economic problems. And a lot of these innovations are coming from applied sciences rather than basic sciences. But as we all know, if all the research in the end is all about making money, then we won't be able to get this sort of culture and ecosystem for basic science. And therefore, China would be continuously suffering from these sort of bottlenecks or breakthroughs. And then, for many years, they will still rely on the US or other Western sources for scientific innovation. So what do you think about this projection? Am I making any sense? If in the end it's all about money and therefore they do research and innovate.
But even there, you'll hear there's a theme coming through here, Hei-Wei. I think actually historical example can show where often something that seems like it's just about making money or just about science actually has to be seen in context. So one of my wonderful Harvard colleagues in the history department, Arnav Ghosh, has written a splendid book called Making It Count, which is about the way in which statistics was developed differently in post-war China and post-war India. And in some ways, at that point, it's often forgotten that statistics, which you might think as the most neutral, the most rational subject you could possibly imagine. I'm sure that as an economist, you spent many, many hours, crunching and grinding through stats.
So it's all a waste of time, but yeah, it's true.
I'm sure it's
spent a lot of time suffering at MIT.
Most suffering at MIT. Well, absolutely. Well, the suffering is what MIT is about. Harvard is about joy. Quite different. One of the things that's forgotten sometimes is that the mid-20th century saw huge battles between the world of capitalist statistics and communist statistics. When you think about, and what does that mean? Think about things such as how you do random sampling. And in fact, this became a deeply ideological issue in many places because the supposedly random sample that you get very much dictates the answer that you'll get in terms of how agriculture works, in terms of the most efficient planting of seeds, or how you decide to assign factory work provisions and so forth. And all of those were things that actually at the time, because they were so imbued with politics in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that actually statistics became almost a kind of destructive force in itself in terms of improving the Chinese economy. I mean, again, the best example of that, and the tragic one, is the Great Leap Forward, where the use of statistics that had in themselves not been randomly sampled, but in fact manufactured, then fed into a supposedly rational system that went horribly wrong. Even when you don't get something that extreme, you do get at that time plenty of reminders that by the time you get to the era of Deng Xiaoping and the 1980s and 90s, one of the greatest liberations that was given to scientists and analysts in China at that time was the freedom just to get the data and process it as they saw fit. Now, today, I think that is going to continue to be one of the biggest issues when it comes to one of the most important tasks, not just in China, but in the world, which is getting the Chinese economy firing up again. Because to get good economic performance, you need lots of things, but one is really good data, which you can then actually make use of in a way that you can trust without fear or favor. And that is, I think, one of the continuing sets of arguments that will shape discussions about the Chinese economy for quite some time to come. Although again, Hei Wei, you're the expert in economics. I'd love to hear what your view would be on this.
I don't think people are here for me, Rana.
Oh, no.
But I mean, the safe word is always cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic about the Chinese economy and also the scientific development. But I'm going to tell you the truth off stage. But let me turn to Brian because time is short, and I do want to make sure that there will be questions from the audience. Brian, as a philosopher studying politics and political philosophy for so many years, I want to hear your view about Rana's sort of final remark about sort of contradiction, behind Marxism and this sort of revival of Marxism in China. And what do you make of that? And why do you think it is sort of emerging all of a sudden, kind of like what in the 80s people brought back Confucianism in China? So how do you rationalize that new development, bringing back Marxism? Is it about governance? Is it about the need to justify some of the development and decision making in China, or again just discuss in general what Rana has said in the last 5 minutes of his speech?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Hei Wei, for that question, because I think it's a relatively light question as compared with all the ones you've asked many prominent luminaries over the past years, including Rana at this forum. No, I was kidding. No, so in short, I've got three broad thoughts in response to your question. The first is a fact that I don't think Marxist-Leninism has ever really receded completely into the background in Chinese, especially contemporary Chinese history. The second is that the emphasis upon the class-based struggle and the need to differentiate or discern between those who have or do not have is a very rational and pragmatic response to natural developmental challenges that China had been facing, especially over the past 2 decades. So it's not a sort of top-down imposition and more as a product and manifestation of the negotiation between the state, the citizenry, the private and the public sectors in China. And the final top-line thesis is we could also apply Marxist-Leninist theory to international relations and think about how China understands hegemony. And also, that's really Anthony Gramsci's framing of hegemony. But you can also assess, what some Chinese international relations theorists would term the primary contradiction, 主要矛盾. Versus a secondary contradiction, 次要矛盾, and the importance of struggle as a multifaceted concept. That's never really left the vein or the sort of undergirding sentiment of the contemporary China, but it's certainly making a comeback today. So let's start with the first thesis, which is the idea of Marxist-Leninism being always there and constantly in the background. It's worth noting that as Deng Xiaoping rose to power and initiated the transformation that was reform and opening up and brought China back from the brink of, what some might term utter destitution, or as I would term it, vast swaths of chaos and also economic uncertainty in the aftermath of, the Cultural Revolution and also Huairentang, Shibian, and a brief fleeting period of Hua Guofeng, on which very exciting and fascinating books have been published recently. Deng Xiaoping had a very important task at hand. He needed to reactivate the Chinese economy, to reconnect China with the world, and to reposition China as, in continuation of Chairman Mao's line to take in relation to the US, as an open partner to the United States and the global North, as a means of putting distance between itself and the Soviet Union without antagonizing it. And therefore, Deng was confronted with almost insurmountable obstacles and challenges, both from within the party, which was incredibly divided. There was no consensus per se, despite, the third plenum and also 1978 and also subsequent battles that took place in the theoretical and the political spaces. But he was also under a lot of pressure economically, structurally, and institutionally. And that was when he emphasized, in his top-down approach to governance in China, that there's no contradiction. There's no incompatibility between what he was doing vis-a-vis China's economy and also economic policy making, and the undergirding Marxist-Leninist lines that prioritize the interests of the people. There was still an emphasis upon 群众路线, which is the mass line. And the mass line was a concept that Mao had introduced, and Rana has written extensively on, and was continued under Deng. It's just that he said, we're at a different stage of the modernization arc, a different part of the journey, and it's high time that we looked at how to, resolve the contradiction or the challenge of the livelihood issues of the people through embracing economic modernization. Jiang Zemin, in turn, adopted 3 represents 科学发展观, the idea of having science drive development. That was actually a Hu and era, sorry. So 3 represents under Jiang and a 科学发展观 under Hu and Wen. But never once was Marxist-Leninism hidden or enshrouded or removed from party dogma. So even in terms of nominal status and the importance accorded to Marxist-Leninism, it didn't decrease. It would only remain, and it indeed had to remain as a fixture to convince people amongst the most orthodox and conservative elements within the party that the CPC had not embarked upon a revisionist line. So at the very least, the rhetorical significance remained. And secondly, of course, as you pointed out, to both of you just then, it's not just making a comeback, or it's also making a comeback in a policy-making domain. And to understand why that's the case, we've got to look at the second prong of my answer here. And that is the present challenges that China have been facing and confronted by, especially at the turn of the decade, so to speak, as we entered into the 2010s, right? What China was riddled with towards the end of the Hu and Wen era were essentially, what Wen Jiabao termed to be a deep structural imbalance in the economy, an excess reliance upon investment, an excess emphasis upon export-led growth to the expense of, and thanks to the suppression of, both wages and consumption growth domestically. And that was no less aided, and it was in fact amplified by the 2008 or post-2008 injection of 4 trillion RMB into the economy. These were all serious root causes of malaise that Xi Jinping had to deal with when he rose to power. What he was faced with then was a country that had serious endemic corruption, rampant inequalities, devastating environmental pollution. When I traveled to Shanghai as a kid, I remember putting on a mask because the air was so bad and it was just yellow skies, cloudy skies, and Hong Kong wasn't much better. At the very least, I could, put on a lighter mask. So that was nice. But essentially, the gist was China was in deep trouble at the turn of that decade, despite all the merits and the pros and the virtues of the Hu and Wen era, which I'm sure many here would be well versed in. The return then of Marxist-Leninist discourse was an attempt to address this on a policy-making level, an acknowledgement that in order for China to move forward and advance its economy, it needed to rebuild the confidence of the people in the officials. It needed to establish a firmer and larger enlarged middle class and draw upon a middle class-led consumption-backed growth in lieu of relying exclusively upon exports and investment, infrastructural and non-performing infrastructural investment at that, to lead its growth, right? And that is why you might say, oh, well, isn't there a comeback and a return of this? And that observation is partially true in the economic policy-making domain, but I would say it's rational. It's not a sort of ideological imposition that's wholly unwarranted and built purely upon the whims and the fancies of 1 or 2 leaders. It's instead a response to serious malaise. Now, whether or not such policies succeed remains to be seen. Is China's overemphasis upon industrial policies, especially in these select sectors we're talking about here, going to yield the fruits that the leaders wanted to yield? Is China succeeding in reviving consumer sentiments and confidence, especially given what happened during COVID? I mean, these are questions that should be asked, not just in the mainland, but especially here in Hong Kong, where we get to understand and appraise China through more unbiased and also neutral and sophisticated lenses. And that ties me on to the final point very briefly, which is the role played by such discourse and rhetoric in shaping the present leadership's worldview. And I would say there are 2 prongs under this. The first prong concerns what we call primary versus secondary contradictions. The standard typical connotations that we associate with Marxist-Leninist thought is that it's rigid, it's dogmatic, it's imposed, it's austere, it belongs to the 15th century, even though Marx obviously wasn't born then. But then, that's a standard connotation. But I would argue against that, because I think the concept of contradiction is itself malleable. As Rana flagged just then, there are lots of possible candidates for contradictory pairs. The environment versus development, growth versus equity. Do we prioritize Yan'an, Yanhai, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Fujian, these provinces, or focus on the inland provinces, right? Shanxi, you name it. Where do we draw the balance? How do we shape this balance? And in the eyes of the leadership, what they term to be the primary contradiction, that's what they will prioritize above other secondary contradictions, right? That's why, for instance, when it came to the Sino-Soviet split, there was a palpable change in the language adopted by leadership, where America was no longer portrayed to be 就是主要矛盾啊，这个 Zhongguo versus 第一世界. That was no longer framed to be the primary contradiction or struggle. Instead, it was against the revanchists, the revisionists in Russia, right, who apparently deviated from the path to take. And when we apply it to the present era, again, I would say, some would posit that China and Russia are natural partners, allies, buddies. But again, what they've overtly neglected there is that for now, I think they've come to the leadership, the agreement that the Sino-Russian difference is not as substantial as a Sino-American difference, and therefore they're willing to set aside divergences and disagreements between Beijing and Moscow to forge this partnership. But note, it's not an alliance. It is not an alliance. There's not an alliance between China and Russia today. But what this was formed and formulated in reaction to is, rightly or wrongly, this growing consensus amongst many in positions of power and influence in China that the West is not willing to play ball with or entertain the notion of a China that could be equally as powerful, equally as vocal, and equal in status with it. I'm not saying this worldview is correct. I'm just saying this is the observation that many in Beijing, and even then it's not a total consensus. There's still dispute, there's still debate, there's still disagreement over such claims, but that there's a growing worldview that suggests that we need to prioritize the primary contradiction today, which is one of facilitating Chinese modernization through ensuring that the imperialist streaks and tendencies in America are pushed back against without the decoupling and the Cold War sentiments that the leadership repeatedly warns against. That's the Chinese leadership mindset that I see it today, and that's also in part, it harks back to what Rana was saying, the importance and centrality of historical imagery and doctrines in molding contemporary political discourse, decisions, and also foreign policy. So I'll stop there because I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Very good, Brian. There was a very good extension and elaboration of what Rana has said during his presentation. I want to continue this discussion about contradiction to have a question for Dee about contradiction. One contradiction as an economist, and I think Rana has put it very clearly, is it's not all about growth and making more money and development. Sometimes we also have to be more concerned about equity, balances, sustainability, and things like that, right? So do you think the contradiction that we have seen being realized in policies in China, facilitating your business or whatever you're doing, as a leader in consumer businesses in the region, how are you seeing this sort of rebalancing of policies as highlighted by both Brian and Rana just now, shaping your business? I mean, I shouldn't say helping or not helping, but how are you going to react to these new normals?
Okay, so I think the first thing I want to say is, listening to Rana, listening to Brian, the feeling I get is, and of course, Hei-Wei, the feeling I get is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with David Foster Wallace and a commencement speech he gave, but in it is a story of an outsider looking in, there's two goldfish, and the guy looks in, he says, "How's the water?" And the goldfish, "What is water?" And so, on this panel, we speak from above, and we speak about the large historic and government forces that are moving society. And of course, on top of that are the global things like climate. But, my job is to sell shirts one at a time. And so I am a goldfish, and I'm very lucky. I get to come to events like this. So luckily I know there is water, but on a day-to-day basis, I really, I just swim. And I think, to Hei-Wei's question about how do I feel about, the environment and policies, etc., I think what Rana said is very true in the sense that China has a model that is very, very state-driven and that is very policy-driven. And that's why there has been the ability to create so much green impact, right? Like sustainable impact and transformation. I have a friend, I'm going to give her a little plug. She's not here today. Her name is Deborah Tan. And if anyone is interested in green, sustainable development in China around, she has a think tank in Hong Kong, it's called China Water Risk. And what they do is, they've sort of mapped out the risks and what we're doing in terms of adaptation. And she does this because it's based on the Himalaya glaciers. It's all across Asia. She's like, look, she'll map it out. She's China's really the only one with a plan. And the only person or the only country based on the Himalayas that's been building enough renewable energy to live with the changes that are going to happen due to the changes in glaciers. As a business, though, again, I don't have to think about that on a day-to-day basis. And I think of the world one shirt at a time, one sale at a time. And I think that's really how I understand the world. And when I look at China, I see it from the first day I started selling shirts on the mainland in Beijing in 2005 and today. And what I see are really big changes. I see this idea of a different generation every 5 years, technology leapfrogging how people think, consume, and live and interact in a way that I really don't see anywhere else. And I see an entrepreneurial energy and a creativity that is so dynamic that it's, I started selling on Douyin live streaming over COVID. And we had this brand and it had not managed to gain any traction on Tmall or in JD offline, etc. And all of a sudden with Douyin, right, because of the data they expose to you against what sells, what you're able to do is so fast and you're able to react and you're able to see how everybody else, because of the proximity to the supply chain, they're able to react almost immediately to put new products on the shelf based on what another person sold 1 hour ago. I think, I know in many ways China is a story or something we understand and that has a great deal of power that comes from the middle out. But because of the way I see it, I see bottom up and I see so much dynamism, energy, and creativity from the new generation that it's just completely different. And I think what I find most interesting about the younger generation compared to the previous generation is we now have a group of consumers who are able to consider beyond just products and fully try to understand lifestyle. And they're building for themselves lifestyles and identities and subcultures that are fully their own, right? And so I think, how will we think about the future? I'm not sure how the master narratives are going to drive anything. And, I think the one thing I took from Rana is that at any moment, it's a combination of what you need, what force is driving, from so many different sides. And from a mental health perspective, the way I think of it and what Rana said is currently we see that from the West, purely a view of China from an economic position or from a realpolitik position, but without the historical position, we lose out. And so in mental health, what we talk about is, I was just at Harvard and I heard a talk from Arthur Kleinman, who is an anthropologist as well as psychiatrist who's done a lot of work in China. And he talks about the transition from a psychological model to a drug-based model to now a biopsychosocial model in mental health, right? And how when we treat a patient today, we are not really able to care or heal them without this full model. Often the economic systems and the way society has created healthcare and caregiving is about purely treating someone so that they can become productive without returning to this idea of how to heal, nurture, or allow them to live a fully human life. And I think this is the question at the core of this panel. As we try to understand the future of China, whether it is as individual consumers, as a consumption class, as a demographic within this country, or as a nation among the states of the world, what model are we going to look? And can we actually appreciate and build more dynamic full models so that we can better try to understand and create a better future together rather than turning back. I think, Brian and I have this argument. Is it even possible to have a Cold War again? Right? Like, can we go back? And, the goal, though, is not that. So let's all just hope. I think it's like sort of impossible. He's like, it's totally possible. But I think the bottom line is if we have a fuller model, if we're willing to take the time to try to understand the historical legacies, as well as what you can actually see from the ground up, right? So these phenomenons of hanfu, of short form fiction and, like short TV shows, and how Chinese people think, act today, I think we'll just have a better likelihood of being able to create new opportunities for cooperation because we'll be able to fully see ourselves or each other as where we're coming from, not just that one lens by which is an insufficient model to understand the world.
This is excellent, Dee. I guess I haven't been saying much. Rana and Brian have been talking at this level, very historical, very macro, and thank you for bringing us down to the goldfish level so that we understand, what's going on in the world should remain very hopeful because decisions and changes are not all driven by the state, by the government, but also by individuals, by young people. I have a lot more questions, but I realize that we only have like 6 minutes left for Q&A, unfortunate. I'm going to take 2 questions, if we may, Rana. I wish I can give you some time to summarize, but maybe 2 questions from the floor. I bet, there are also, there's one over there, a gentleman with a pink shirt, I think.
Very, very simple question. From your historical review, do you predict there will be military conflict between the United States and China?
This is a question for you, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Give us time to think of that.
Well, although I know Brian wants to answer that question, but maybe take one more question you want, Rana, or you want to answer this one first? Maybe just answer this one first.
Okay. I don't think history, well, despite, of course, my brilliant colleague at HKS, Graham Allison, who I think comes through this territory on occasion, has written about this extensively in his book, Destined for War, which, as many people point out, should have a question mark, really, at the end of the title. I think that clearly, if we're being honest, the potential is there, and the governments of both countries would acknowledge that and indeed have stated that on various occasions. I think, nonetheless, in the medium term, the economic imperatives of both China and the United States are such that it seems that they will do a great deal to avoid it. China, on the grounds that its current economic model needs a lot of input to actually get back to some significant level of growth. And the one thing that would absolutely destroy that possibility is conflict. And in the case of the United States, obviously it is already involved in a broader sense in support of 2 conflicts, one in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and one in the Middle East. And the idea of adding a 3rd theater is, I think, the nightmare of any American politician, regardless actually of which party that politician is in. So at least in the medium term, I think that the current circumstances suggest not.
But this is only under the assumption that the 2 wars that we have right now are going to last for a few more years. But, if one of the wars got settled, there's a chance for another war to break out somewhere.
Well, that sounds a bit like sort of certain types of restaurant where you can only order a certain number of things. I think one thing that with the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, even if they are settled very soon, the aftermath in terms of not only reconstruction, rebuilding in both places, but also, I'll give you the front headline of the Financial Times today, some of you have seen it. It says that spending on defense around the world has gone to records that are unprecedented since the Cold War. So if we're talking about Cold War mentalities, that's definitely in there.
Great. Thank you, Rana. One last question before we, yes, this gentleman over there.
Thank you. This question is directed to Mr. Rana Mitter. Regarding China's history, we have seen recent developments where they are pushing more towards Taiwan and updating new maps. Now, to what degree do you think the CCP's rhetoric of the maps being a source of national harmony and patriotism plays into their global what's the word?
Strategy?
So yeah, global strategy towards like bringing back the old Chinese empire that used to exist before the advent of the first Sino-Japanese War, or like people coming, or before the May 4th movement, as you've mentioned in your book.
Shall I?
Yeah, please go ahead. Maybe we'll take one more later. Yeah.
Okay, so a brief answer to that question is that I think that the use clearly of maps and the insertion of those maps into international law in particular are part of a quite strong and confrontational strategy, which is aiming to argue that certain maritime claims in particular are part of the expansion of where China should have undisputed access. Particularly in the South China Sea, it's very clear that other countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, amongst them, don't share that. I did make a version of this point actually also recently to a Chinese think tank analyst when I asked why it was that China was not pushing harder on the recovery of Outer Mongolia, which people here will know if they've checked their history, was part of the Qing Empire until 1911, and then essentially was sort of formally abandoned after Stalin held a referendum on the status of Outer Mongolia in 1945, in which, if I remember correctly, the votes in favor of staying independent from China and therefore allied to Stalin were about 450,000. And in favor of returning to China, the vote was 0. So that was obviously entirely unbiased and free and fair referendum in that case. But my, the very well-informed, historically informed think tanker I spoke to didn't seem to think that China was going to push hard on getting Outer Mongolia back. So clearly, even on those historical examples, they can be selective.
Can I violate the rule to finish by 6:30 and extend it by 5 more minutes? Did anyone object my decision here? Okay, so maybe we can take 2 more questions if that's the case. One here.
Thank you for the speakers. I am more wanting to ask the role of Hong Kong in terms of the conflict, recent conflict between the U.S. and China. Do Hong Kong still have a role to play? And what do you think is the role that Hong Kong to play in order to be peacemakers? I mean, is there anything other than what you have described that we can play for Hong Kong?
No, I mean, I don't know, like, I started thinking about Dee's description about goldfish, but I should let you answer, Rana.
I honestly think actually one of the, perhaps Dee, you should, Hong Kong people really should answer about Hong Kong's role.
It's interesting. Again, like I come to the world with a very ungeopolitical view. But what as a retailer, as a person who's involved with brands, who's involved with marketing, what I see is the ability to persuade and to create not information, but like narrative and engagement through stories. And I see this often, like, in whether it's Li Ning signing an American basketball star to drive his basketball shoe because it's an NBA sport, or Prada having a collaboration with like some local Chinese coffee shop, right? What I see is that we create understanding in collaboration, in commerce all the time, because to reach a consumer, you need to speak to them in the way they understand and with what they like. I dare not say what, there are certain things that are totally above my pay grade, but what I do see as an opportunity for Hong Kong and for people like me and is this idea of, bringing outward our stories and our brands and our institutions to share that we're pretty normal and that we're similar and that we share similar concerns. And I think that's a very normalizing role for anything in the world, right, that is chaotic, is to be able to create common parlance. And we're perhaps better at that as marketers than often people who are, who have a different set of outcomes they need to think about and a much larger pool of interests and KPIs.
Brian, two minutes, please.
Yeah. Sorry, very quickly. I've got just 4 Ds: diversify, differentiate, debate, and diplomacy. Diversify. We need to engage a vast range of markets beyond just America and the global north, because we've got to face up to the reality that the good old days of Sino-West rapprochement and also friendship, they're past. That ship has sailed. The ship has sailed very far, further than many of the princes from the UAE. He's also sailed very far as well. I think we need to engage the Middle East and ASEAN seriously, not just in name, not just via visitations and delegations, but ask what value can we add to them? How can we get our education, through our workforce and labor reskilling, how can we get our people up to snuff? Because at the moment we're not. We're far from being ready to handle the era where Asia does indeed rise and can stand to be a multitude of poles in a multipolar era, if that is indeed to materialize, if at all. Secondly, differentiate. We need to keep ourselves different from the mainland. That's one country, 2 systems for a reason. 2 systems. Not one system. And Beijing wants that from us. Beijing, Xi Jinping himself said he wants the common law system in Hong Kong to be preserved, the one country, 2 systems institutions to be preserved, the cultures and the discursive freedom and the openness to be preserved. This is, Hong Kong's uniqueness is not just what serves Hong Kongers, the 7.5 million whom we all love and share this plot of wonderful land with. It's also the entirety of the country. By keeping Hong Kong distinct, China therefore has a sandbox for experimentation, an exemplar for reforms to guide itself in its forward-looking thinking and progress. And finally, in demonstrating to the world that China is a mature power that can accommodate a multitude of differences and divergences in methods of governance whilst retaining and safeguarding national security, which is an understandable baseline matter for the country at large. Thirdly, debate. We've got to keep more conversations like these flowing, like the fantastic ones involving, Rana and Haywai, hosted by the incredible and inimitable AGI, but also the debates you have in your private conversations, over the dinner table, at boardroom meetings. Keep them sincere, keep them genuine and authentic. I think that's the key, because the last thing we want is for sycophancy and this tendency to toe the line, to repeat well-trotted, memorized propagandistic mottos to dominate and crowd out the truth. We live in the truth and we embrace the truth. That's how the CPC has survived, by seeking truth from fact. That's why 求是叫求是, and that's also why we read 求是 to understand the party, as I did this morning. I read a very, very good piece by not every morning, I'm not that devout, but I do read, I do read. And finally, diplomacy. I think citizens, private individuals, academics, businesses like Dee's and of course Margie's incredible business, they play a steering role in bridging the gap, in bridging the divide across the Pacific, but also across and between China and other parts of the world. So, I love Hong Kong and I love China as a Chinese citizen. That's it. Thank you very much.
4 minutes.
Cheers.
All right. I wish I could take one more question, but I realized...
Just add one thing to that. I mean, I think, for me, the biggest fear is not whether we have room, is whether we step up to the position, right? And I think, it's we're very, very battered. From 2019 until last year, I mean, the economy's continued to be bad post-opening. And I think Hong Kong people are tired and we're exceptionally resilient. But this idea that we now need to double down, step up and take some real swings, we have the room. There's so much runway for us in so many different directions. And the question is whether we're going to do it. And I think that's the bigger question than that, if we're going to do it, not if there is a space for us. There's definitely a space for us.
Great. Thank you, Dee. So we don't have time for an additional question. I'm sorry, but I want to give the last 2 minutes to Rana. A very simple question for you. The stuff that you just presented, deep, excellent, but it's so hard for people like me and the rest of the world mostly to understand what's going on in China, the 3-dimensional understanding of China. What does it mean by having these sort of communities of common destiny? I mean, all this stuff are great if you understand them. If you don't understand them, you will easily take them as sort of strategies against the US and the West. What should we do academics, people around here. And it's so great that you joined the Harvard Kennedy School because it's a school that is full of political scientists, full respect, and economists, some respect. But historian like you, what is your mission, to, I may say, educate the rest of the world to understand China maybe a bit better?
I think that, thank you very much, Hei Wei. And could I just say again, thank you to you and to Sabrina, Victor, and everyone else who's been involved, and actually to the wonderful panelists here as well. Dee and Brian have given up their very valuable time to make this a really rich discussion. And I hope that informally, in just a few minutes, we can catch up on a few of the questions and thoughts that we couldn't do formally here. I would say that one of the things that looking at history and looking at philosophy and frameworks of thinking does is to remind us that in most societies and countries, looking inward is a very important part of the mixture. By that I mean that sometimes when you're in the US or in Europe, but I think it's more a case in the US actually, you can assume that everything that's happening in China is really about the competition with the United States. And lots of things are, obviously, but actually that's not what I think occupies people most extensively. Similarly, people in China, particularly at elite levels who are involved with think tanks and so forth, are perhaps more inclined to think that America is thinking about them more often than it is. I mean, the US presidential election will be decided on lots of things. Actually, weirdly enough, I don't think China will be a central element of it, despite the fact that obviously it's a controversial topic. So let me finish, if I may, by just saying something that I've said, once or twice, in answer to people who ask exactly that question, which is, when China as a society, it could be leaders, but it could actually be social media, it could be social enterprises of a sort that Dee, I think, knows very well, but Brian too, could be academics, it could be just, anyone living in their community, some shequ in Beijing or in Chongqing or somewhere. What might they be thinking about? So let me give you a very quick sketch to finish this. Take a woman, say, in her early 30s. She works, let's say, in financial services in a growing area in China. She's doing okay, but she's worried because, first of all, her parents are getting older, not quite sure where there's going to be space, either in a very small apartment or maybe in a special home or somewhere to look after them. Also, healthcare is getting more expensive. Need to be looking at, you talked about mental health. I mean, this is a big issue with China's aging population. We're talking about, millions of people now needing antidepressants. This is not something that anyone ever talks about in Sino-American relations. They talk about fentanyl. They never talk about Zoloft, but anyway, maybe that should be the next question. At the same time, she's got a kid, one child, still from that generation, will make her a single mother. It's not that common in China, but it's becoming more common than it was. Education, Britain, where I was living recently, is a socialist country where everything is free. Not China, which of course is a communist country where education is expensive, and then you need special tutoring to get in the Gaokao. Savings in a shadow bank because actually the main banks aren't giving a high enough interest rate, and the mortgage is really, really expensive. All of these, if you know anything about China, and you in this room know a lot about China, can recognize some, if not every aspect of that scenario. That is what can and should be seen as the set of problems that China needs to deal with. That only has solutions in as much as they relate to anything to do with the United States that can be cooperative ones. There are no solutions to the problems of that woman in Ningbo or Chongqing, wherever you want to name, that involve a confrontation with the United States. And that is something I think Hong Kong people, Chinese people, American and Europeans should all come to realize. But in the West, we need to recognize more who that woman is. I'm going to call her Zhang Xiaodan. I've made up a name for her. Get to know Zhang Xiaodan and then start from there in solving the questions.
Great. This is an excellent ending, Rana. Thank you so much for today's presentation and sharing. I find that in the end, we all get connected with each other. Your final remark actually resonates very well with what Dee said, right? We have enough problems to solve. We have all these micro problems that we should focus on, and don't be overconsumed by geopolitics or maybe what's going on in certain governments. Thank you so much, Rana, and please give another round of applause to him. And also Dee and Brian, excellent contribution. Thank you.